Hello there. I'm Kevin Costola. I'm the host of the Dissenter Weekly. Welcome to the show. I curate and edit the Dissenter newsletter, which is a weekly newsletter that covers whistleblowers, press freedom, and government secrecy. So if you're new here, thank you. But if you're receiving this on February 14th, which is Valentine's Day, consider this my love letter to press freedom, whistleblowing, and government transparency, and consider this my way of thanking you for supporting the independent journalism that the Dissenter produces regularly. So you're getting this, and we'll have a full set of headlines and more headlines than we've had on prior shows. And also, there's a story that I'm anxious to get to because of its peculiarity. But for now, let me just say to those of you who are stumbling on the show as it streams on YouTube that I encourage you to become a subscriber. Go to thedissenter.org and support this newsletter. If you are not familiar with it, take the time to read some of the articles. We're tracking developments with President Donald Trump's return to the White House. And donate if you're able to give. If you're able to give just a few dollars, that makes it possible. Some of you out there might not be able to regularly subscribe and give money on a monthly basis to ensure that there is independent journalism out there on these consequential issues. But if you do like what I do, if you do like some of the voices that you hear on this broadcast last week, we had Chip Gibbons, policy director for Defending Rights and Dissent. I spoke to him about a case, Espionage Act prosecution against Asif Rahman. And so if you're able to support what we're putting out here, you can chip in a few dollars by going to this link. Now let's get right down to it. As I said, a full slate of headlines for you to share. Tulsi Gabbard was confirmed as Director of National Intelligence. She will be Donald Trump's James Clapper. Tulsi, who is a former Democratic representative, now a Republican, was confirmed by the U.S. Senate. During her confirmation hearing, Gabbard refused to distance herself from her support for NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden and label him a traitor. Trump had threatened any Republican who might decide to vote against her nomination. And after doing so, she basically sailed through the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, came up for a Senate floor vote, and then passed. It was a party line vote. Not a single Democrat voted for Tulsi Gabbard.
During this time, unfortunately, the American people have very little trust in the intelligence community, largely because they've seen the weaponization and politicization of an entity that is supposed to be purely focused on ensuring our national security. So I look forward to being able to help fulfill that mandate that the American people delivered to you very clearly in this election.
The next story that I have for you is the top government whistleblower protector who's fired by Trump and then later reinstated by the courts. Hampton Dellinger is the chief of the Office of Special Counsel. It's a little known office, but one that is important for government whistleblowers. And Dellinger was granted a temporary restraining order to return to his post. The Trump White House had not accused him of inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance, which they must legally do to remove him. They must have cause in order to remove him from his position. He was terminated, however, because they perceived him as disloyal. Decisions by a trial and appellate judge allowed Dellinger to resume his responsibilities overseeing this office. And this office, by the way, is one that handles internal government whistleblower complaints, which if people are able to overcome the fear that they might be experiencing right now, I'm sure that there are numerous complaints that have piled up in the last couple of weeks. Another story here that we will get to: for the past several years, officials in the United Kingdom have seemingly discouraged companies from offering their customers end-to-end encryption for their data. Of course, data privacy is very essential for those who are engaged in journalism and important for media sources who could be whistleblowers. Now, the Washington Post has reported that a secret order under the country's investigatory powers law requests that Apple grant British security officials access to encrypted iCloud data of any Apple customer in the world, potentially. As UK government officials expand these surveillance authorities, ramp up these types of requests, Apple has said that they may have to discontinue services with encryption, such as FaceTime or iMessage, so they would no longer be offered to those in the UK. Colorado lawmakers are again attempting to pass a bill that would better establish police whistleblower protections after failing to pass such legislation last year. This round, according to the Denver Post, 2 Democratic state representatives consulted and negotiated with Colorado police chiefs and other rank and file officers before they could undermine the effort through their opposition. The proposal that is being put forward is that officers who report misconduct would be protected in their speech, and that officers who face retaliation for doing so, such as demotions or reassignments or being fired, would be able to file a lawsuit in response. And as the Marshall Project has documented or covered, in the United States, many police departments expect officers to report wrongdoing up the chain of command, which often results in retaliation and further reinforces what is commonly known as the blue wall of silence, perhaps best represented in the 1970s film Serpico about police whistleblower Frank Serpico. 2,400 JFK assassination files were uncovered by the FBI. They said that after President Trump ordered the release of all records related to the assassination, that they were able to identify these records, which were never shared with the JFK Assassination Records Review Board that was tasked with disclosure of the files after the JFK Records Collection Act passed in the 90s. In the early 90s, they were conducting this review. Elon Musk is hiding his financial disclosure report. As CBS News reported, Musk and the Trump administration intend to keep this required financial disclosure report from us, the public. As a designated special government employee, he is required to file this disclosure to reveal any conflicts of interest, and the news reporting has indicated that there are potentially numerous conflicts of interest, as several government agencies were investigating Musk before Trump took office, and his companies and have several government contracts, or have had several government contracts. Legislators in New Mexico have put forward a bill modeled after the Press Act, which failed in the previous session of Congress. This is a bill that I talked about a number of times last year, as the Democrats failed to get it to the finish line and to the desk of President Joe Biden to sign. The bill would bar state agencies in New Mexico from forcing reporters to reveal their confidential sources under subpoena or to disclose information that they gathered during the course of their work but have not published. So any reporter's notes, anything like that, they would not be able to force the disclosure and use for whatever purpose they desired. The Trump administration is frustrated with reporters who are covering immigration and customs enforcement raids against immigrants in states like California, Colorado, Illinois, and New York. In Denver, a local news team reported on a raid that targeted apartment buildings and a mobile home community. According to the Columbia Journalism Review, the number of people arrested was much lower than ICE had claimed. When their fake numbers were exposed, Tom Homan, the Trump border czar, blamed the local news media. The Columbia Journalism Review highlights several instances where the Trump administration has incorrectly insisted that leaks were causing them problems. Really, what they object to is unembedded journalism. Like the US military, they would like reporters to tag along with ICE agents so they can control what is broadcast or published. Case in point, an ABC News reporter was denied access to a press briefing from Tim Lenzen, acting special agent in charge of Denver's Homeland Security Investigations Office, after they independently reported on an ICE raid or were not embedded. And Homeland Security is what the ICE agents fall under. They're part of the Department of Homeland Security. The Committee to Protect Journalists put out their report on journalist deaths in 2024. It was the deadliest year on record, at least since they began to do their work as a press freedom organization. And they found that 70% of journalists killed were killed by the Israeli military forces. Several dozen of them were killed deliberately by Israeli military forces. They conducted investigations. They were able to research and look into the circumstances of the deaths and confirm that those journalists were deliberately targeted. And finally, an Associated Press reporter in the White House press corps has been banned from White House events for 3 days. The ban stems from the AP's decision to keep calling the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of Mexico instead of Trump's name, the Gulf of America. It's called the Gulf of Mexico by the AP still because they publish for an international readership, and the world recognizes this body of water as the Gulf of Mexico. The Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression was strong and clear in their condemnation. They said, quote, punishing journalists for not adopting state-mandated terminology is an alarming attack on press freedom. That's viewpoint discrimination and it's unconstitutional. End of quote. So here is White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt being questioned about the White House policy.
But isn't it retaliatory in nature is the argument, because the reason that the AP was barred, which they said was because they're not using the phrase Gulf of America, they're using Gulf of Mexico in line with their standards. And so the question here is this setting a precedent that this White House will retaliate against reporters who don't use the language that you guys believe reporters should use? And how does that align with the First Amendment commitment that you were just talking about?
I was very upfront in my briefing on day one that if we feel that there are lies being pushed by outlets in this room, we are going to hold those lies accountable. And it is a fact that the body of water off the coast of Louisiana is called the Gulf of America. And I'm not sure why news outlets don't want to call it that, but that is what it is. The Secretary of Interior has made that the official designation in the geographical identification name server. And Apple has recognized that. Google has recognized that. Pretty much every other outlet in this room has recognized that body of water as the Gulf of America. And it's very important to this administration that we get that right, not just for people here at home, but also for the rest of the world.
So there you go. I was not prepared for Hannah Montana to take such a dark turn. But seriously, what I would say is to reporters who are frustrated, pursue legal action if you would like, and raise your voice and object. But also, maybe get your colleagues together and convince them that they're simply wasting their time by being there in the room for these press briefings, by being in the room for Oval Office events like executive order signings or the swearing in ceremonies for these nominees have been confirmed to positions in the administration. You don't have to be at these ceremonial events. You might find that it's a better use of time and resources to assign these people to investigative journalism. I'm one of those people that believe that this is a total waste of time, and that in fact you're being used as props. These questions that are asked, the press secretary there is always using those reporters to try and make the administration look good. It's spin. It always has been. It was spin under Biden. It was spin under the first Trump administration. And there was a fair amount of spinning going on under President Barack Obama. And they use reporters to burnish the image that the White House wants to project to the public. So part of being ordered to call things by a particular name, or else you can't be seated for briefings or allowed access to the Oval Office, is about maintaining that image. It's authoritarian, but Trump is not the first president to try and enforce people to obey certain codes or to follow certain guidelines, so to speak. They're not the first administration to find that an individual reporter had actually ticked them off. So that's that story. And finally, the last thing that I want to get to, our story for today, involves the state of Hawaii. In the state of Hawaii, you may not think that this is a state that has a problem when it comes to press freedom. And I don't think they do, which is why this caught my attention. In Hawaii, a state senator has proposed what I believe should be called a star chamber for journalists, in the sense that it's an ethics review board that this state senator would like to see established, in which people would be reviewing the actions of journalists and would have the power to fine reporters or suspend their access to state government events if they violate the board's code. The state senator, her name is Donna Mercado Kim, seems to be coming at this from a liberal standpoint. So we're not talking about a kind of conservative or right-wing attitude towards the news media, which we see coming out of the Trump White House. This is an effort to curb misinformation. It's a kind of form of censorship, of liberal gatekeeping that we have seen popularized, or it has become a fashionable priority for politicians since the 2016 election. You can go all the way back almost 10 years now. The U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, a project of the Freedom of the Press Foundation, contains very few incidents against reporters in the state of Hawaii. So then I'm a little bit mystified by this, but I think it has less to do with cracking down on the press and more about controlling the press. So this has about 7 sponsors, co-sponsors. It's notably not the first bill that the state senator has attempted to pass. Last year, a bill was introduced that sought to establish, and this is kooky, a mechanism for requesting public records from the news media, just like citizens are able to request records under FOIA from government agencies. And this legislation introduced died. The Ethics Review Board would be made up of one member who is a professor of journalism from the University of Hawaii School of Communication and Information, a journalism school professor, one member representing print media, one member representing broadcast television, one member representing broadcast radio, one member representing digital media, including social media. So you would have online news outlets working in competition with the posters to Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or Threads or Blue Sky or what have you. And then there would be one member that represented the public. These would be people appointed by the governor of Hawaii. So they would all be political appointees. This would not be an independent body. And in the legislation, it says that the commission shall render advisory opinions upon request as to whether the facts and circumstances of a particular case constitute or will constitute a violation of the journalistic code of ethics. They're going to administer a journalistic code of ethics. Where does the journalistic code of ethics come from, you might be asking? What are these rules? They're not actually contained in the proposed bill, because what they say is they will follow the code of ethics that is promoted and has been adopted by the Society of Professional Journalists. What does SPJ, the Society of Professional Journalists, think of all of this? They vehemently object. SPJ is troubled, they say in a press statement, that Hawaii lawmakers have proposed using its code of ethics to abridge press freedom. Under the legislation, journalists would be required to follow the SPJ code. The bill would create a state journalistic ethics commission and review board to investigate complaints and impose penalties for violations. The proposal goes against SPJ's values. And they say it was created as a guidance for journalists rather than rules that require compliance. So this bill would take what are guidelines and it would say if reporters don't follow those ethical rules or guidelines, then they could be fined for those violations. So the SPJ national president, her name is Emily Block, said, while the Society of Professional Journalists is flattered that the Hawaii state legislature recognizes the SPJ code of ethics as a gold standard for journalistic integrity, we must strongly oppose any attempt to use our code as a tool for policing journalists through legislation. Such measures fundamentally contradict the principles of the First Amendment and the freedom of the press. Journalists must remain free from government interference in order to serve the public effectively, hold the powerful accountable, and protect democracy. This proposed legislation not only undermines press freedom, but also threatens the very foundation of ethical, independent journalism. But where this comes from is this culture that is right-wing at its core. It is authoritarian at its core, but it has become more popular among liberal Democrats over the last 4 to 8 years. They see disinformation, they see misinformation, they see the way that social media platforms allow content to proliferate that has influencers or popular commentators spouting off false information, spouting off ideas, ideological garbage, and their response is, let's censor. We need to control this. We can't let people consume this drivel. And their frustration is counter to the First Amendment right of speech, and anybody who celebrates or values freedom of expression has to oppose the way in which they are trying to control how people freely exchange ideas and communicate with each other online. We have a right to consume false information. It is up to us to figure out if it is untrue. If our society is degraded by such trash, then something has to be done to promote media literacy. Something has to be done to educate people to understand. I don't know, perhaps you could have politicians that are responsive to the needs of the public, so they are less inclined to believe some of the things that are not based in reality that take on a certain level of popularity. But the answer to dealing with this is never to go after journalists and police what they are publishing, or to go after commentators and police what they are saying on their shows. It is to deal with things from a policy perspective and to address those issues rather than trying to suppress speech. Because I think what you find is if you can tackle the issues that are the result of this propaganda, this disinformation, whatever it is, if you can find the source of the money behind some of these operations and find a way to counter it through policymaking or through simply speaking out from the bully pulpit, you have people who are elected officials who can use their platform to speak on these matters. That should be good enough to show people that this isn't accurate material. And yet you have Democrats who have reflexively fallen back. I think there's Republicans that feel this way too. They fall back on this idea that the press must be controlled. And that is an idea that should always and forever be rejected. Thank you for tuning in to this week's show. I appreciate all of you and your interest and support for the Dissenter newsletter. I'll be back next week with another show.